The messenger. The ride to the Portsmouth area was treacherous. Ice crusted the salt marshes, and the wind howled off the Narragansett Bay. Williams did not go himself. He was an old man, and the war was not yet over, but he sent a trusted messenger with a sealed letter. Mary Tefft was outside her home, perhaps tending to what little livestock had survived the raids, when she saw the rider approaching. In those days, a lone messenger at a gallop rarely brought anything but grief. The rider pulled his horse to a halt, the animal's breath blooming in white clouds. He didn't dismount. He simply reached into his coat and handed Mary the parchment. "From Mr. Williams," the messenger said, his voice grim, "regarding your son." The notice. Mary's fingers were numb as she broke the wax seal. She didn't need to read the whole letter to understand its weight. Williams had written with his characteristic directness, tempered by a sliver of mercy. "I have spoken at length with Joshua. He maintains his innocence of heart, though the army finds him guilty of the most heinous treasons. He spoke of you in his final hours here. Be aware, Mary, that the sentence is passed. May God have mercy on his soul, for the council of war will have none." Mary stood in the freezing Rhode Island wind, the paper fluttering in her hand. She looked toward the horizon, towards Bristol, where the smoke of the army's camp rose into the gray sky. She knew what no mercy meant. In the eyes of the law, her son was a traitor. In the eyes of the tribe, he was a captive. But to her, he was simply Joshua, her son. And as the messenger rode away, the silence of the winter woods felt heavier than it ever had before. The Tefft name would survive, but from that day on, it would always carry the shadow of the man who lived between two fires. Samuel reached the door. He paused, his hand hovering over the latch. How do you tell a woman that the world has not only taken her husband and her son, but that it has torn them apart in the process? The threshold. Samuel stepped inside. The room was dim, lit only by a dying hearth and a single tallow candle. Mary sat by the fire, her hands moving instinctively over a piece of parchment she could no longer see in the gloom. She didn't look up immediately, but her shoulders stiffened. She knew the cadence of her son's step, and she knew the silence that followed a man who brought no hope. Samuel first heard the news from the locals. A loose, traumatized band of English survivors and colonial militia filtering through the wreckage of the Narragansett territories. The news was not a singular report. It was a fragmented storm of awful rumors that gathered force with every telling. "Samuel," she said, her voice a fragile thread. "Mother." He moved to the hearth, held his shaking hands toward the heat, but felt nothing. The unspoken truth. He looked at her, at the woman who had survived the wilderness, the Great Swamp Massacre, and the starvation of a colonial winter. He realized then that he couldn't tell her everything. He couldn't tell her about the drawn and quartered sentence for Joshua. He couldn't describe the sight of the Indian prince emerging from the woods with the bundle containing her husband's head. He understood his duty. He was the bridge now. He had to absorb the gore of the story so she could have the grief. "I have been to the garrison," Samuel began, his voice cracking like dry wood. "And I have been to the old clearing." Mary finally looked at him. Her eyes were deep wells of silver in the firelight. "Is it done, then? Both of them?" "Both," Samuel whispered. "The gentle lie. The locals. They said Joshua spoke of you." Samuel lied, or perhaps hoped. "He went to the Lord with his head held high, Mother. Mr. Williams himself sat with him. He wasn't a traitor in his heart." Mary closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the deep lines of her face. "And your father, John?" "The warriors." Samuel knelt at her feet, taking her cold, papery hands in his own. "He is home, Mother. I have laid him in the earth myself. He is resting in the home lot, right beside Joshua. The war is over for them. They are side by side. The burden of the son." He didn't mention the decapitation. He didn't mention the quartering. He spoke only of the side-by-side burial, making it sound like a peaceful reunion rather than a desperate act of reclamation in a graveyard of shadows. Mary leaned her forehead against Samuel's. For a long time, the only sound was the popping of the green wood in the fire. "You did your duty, Samuel," she whispered. As he held her, Samuel felt the immense weight of the Teft legacy settle onto his shoulders. He had delivered the news, protected her spirit from the most gruesome truths, and anchored the family back into the Rhode Island soil. He was the messenger of a tragedy, but in his mercy, he had also become the architect of their survival. The fire in the hearth was a dying eye, glowing a dull, resentful red as the winter wind rattled the shutters of the small Portsmouth shelter. Mary Teft sat in the shadows, her body as still as the frozen salt marshes outside. In her lap sat the small wooden chest she had carried through the terror of the great swamp and the flight from the burning homesteads. She reached inside, her fingers moving past the rough wool of a folded shawl until she found it. It was an oyster shell, unusually large and thick, its outer surface weathered by the Atlantic to a chalky white. But the interior was a masterpiece of the deep. A swirling mosaic of bruised purple and pearlescent gray, shimmering like the surface of the Narragansett Bay at twilight. John had given it to her a lifetime ago, back when the Rhode Island woods felt like a promise rather than a graveyard. She looked down at the shell in her hand. The purple and gray mosaic seemed to glow in the dim light, a fragment of the bay that had once fed them, a piece of the man who had loved her. "We'll need 1,000 more of these to make the lime for the chimney," John remarked, tracing the pearlescent curve. Mary laughed, a sound that filled the small space with more warmth than the fire ever could. "So, this little fish is the mortar holding our roof up?" "In a way," John replied, his voice softening. "Every shell we pull from the bay is another stone in the wall. It's the strength of the sea holding us together, Mary. As long as the oysters keep growing, this house isn't going anywhere." Years later, as Mary sat in the dim light of 1676, clutching that same shell while Samuel spoke of the side-by-side burial, the memory of that laughter was what kept her upright. The mortar had changed. It was no longer just the lime and sand holding up a chimney. It was the memory of that first morning oyster, the salt, the laughter, and the promise John had made. The war had taken the man, and it had taken the house they had built together. But as Mary squeezed the shell, she realized the mortar hadn't failed. The home wasn't the building. It was the family that Samuel was now protecting. It was the father and son lying together in the earth. The shell was the only piece of the foundation she had left, but it was enough to hold her together through the longest night of her life. She didn't hear the details of the war. She didn't hear the names of the generals or the counts of the dead. She only felt the cold, smooth pearl of the oyster shell. She remembered John's voice. "It's the mortar that holds this home together," as she looked at her son, at the way Samuel had stepped into the gap to protect her, to bring his father home, and to shield her from the worst of the truth. She realized the mortar had held after all. The stone walls of their first cabin might have been scorched by fire, and the men who built them might be lying in the dark earth of the home lot, but the family was still standing. The mortar wasn't made of lime and ash. It was made of memories like this one, of a cold morning, a salty kiss, and a purple-stained shell that refused to break, even when the world around it fell apart.